Good morning, everyone. Good evening, or perhaps afternoon, regardless of where you are tuning into us today. Thank you for joining us on the webinar. Today's webinar is SharePoint for Communicators, with a focus on content management and empowering content creation across the organization. This is part of our monthly Intranet Insight webinar series. I'm your host, Toby Ward, and today we are joined by a special guest, a 15-time SharePoint MVP, author of 26 books, including the definitive user guide for business owners and communicators called the SharePoint Shepherd, Robert Bogue from Thor Projects. How are you, Robert? Or Rob, as we could say. By the way, it looks like you're self-muted. While Rob figures out his, oh, now
there
perhaps.
We go.
There. How are you doing?
There we go. I'm doing very well.
I tried to unmute you, but then it looked like I muted you.
Yeah, that's okay.
You'd think this is the
my wife does that sometimes. So, yeah, no, I'm doing very well. I'm happy to be here and chat. I mean, I always love chatting with you, but this time we get to talk to other people as well, so it's great.
Yeah. And Thor Projects, you guys specialize in SharePoint, and you've been a specialist in SharePoint since the year 2000, so it's almost 20 years for you.
Yeah, thanks for telling everybody my age in an indirect way. Yeah, we've been doing SharePoint for a very long time. And as we were talking before the show, the opportunity to see the change has been amazing, and what we can do for clients now versus what we could do for them then is really neat, particularly in the area of helping them transform the way that the entire organization feels about their communication. So we really love that work. It's a good thing to be able to do.
Well, you've got the experience and the expertise, so glad you could join us on another webinar. Let's talk about, before I do a quick introduction of myself, what you're going to learn today and what we're focused on, so you know that you're in the right webinar or not. We are talking about SharePoint. We are talking about it from the communicators or the business owner's perspective, with a real specialty and focus on social, content management, and creating content and content controls, something that Rob has a particular expertise in, and which we will dive into towards the end of the webinar. We are going to run about 1 hour today. If there's lots of questions, we will go late, and if you have to drop early, by all means, you can do so. You will get a recording of the webinar tomorrow. You'll get a link to it and a link to the slides as well. Who are we? Well, we are the Intranet experts. We've been doing this for nearly 20 years ourselves. Actually, the first Intranet I worked on was in 1996, so a little bit more than that if you include that. We've had the good fortune of working with some great clients and organizations over the years. And by the way, 80% of our clients use SharePoint and Office 365. And we've kind of been there, done that. For those of you who are already a client and have worked with us in the past or are working with us presently, thank you for your business and thank you for joining in. Without further introductions, let's get into SharePoint, starting with an overview. Rob, it's kind of taken the Intranet by storm. SharePoint is now in more than 200,000 organizations, 200 million paid seats, and more than 40% of all the seats and more than 60% of new seats are in SharePoint Online Office 365. Office 365 has added extra fuel to the SharePoint fire, hasn't it?
It has.
Yeah. It is present in about 80% of our clients. We use it for our own intranet. Rob uses it for his intranet at Thor Projects, and it's evolving practically every day. For those of you in the cloud already in Office 365, you're getting sometimes reminders of updates or feature rollouts, sometimes more than twice a week. I think this week I've gotten an administrator email or updates email pretty much every day this week. Has it been, Rob?
Yeah, it's about what I'm seeing. I have them shunted because I'm on so many clients that we sometimes don't read all the sets of them.
Yeah, it's almost tough to keep track. And
Yeah.
that's the benefit of being in the cloud and moving to the cloud. So, what's the difference? SharePoint 2019, that is the latest that just came out a few months ago, on premises. It is the on premises version, but if you go that route, you are expected to maintain and manage and update it, and you get upgrades only every 3 years, major upgrades. In the cloud, everything's managed for you, so updates and patches are taken care of. You get the latest and greatest in new features, and it's, as they say, the ever-evolving platform, isn't it? Now, let's take a second just to find out where you guys are at. Do you use SharePoint? Are you thinking about it? Where are you in your organization in relation to SharePoint today? Are you using it? Are you thinking about it? Are you using the latest and greatest in Office 365 or SharePoint 2019? Are you in an older version? Cast your vote now, and we'll just see so that we can tailor our information and our slides and our advice to you based on what you're telling us. I'll give you
Yeah, while
5
they're
more
doing that,
seconds,
while
and
they're
then
doing
we,
that, Toby, one of the things that we could talk about is the neat thing about pulling the on-prem 2019 together with Office 365. So you put most of your things in Office 365, getting all the updates, and then anything that's legacy or it's your bridge to all of your on-prem systems can be really handled through SharePoint 2019. So you can kind of get that best of both worlds.
yeah, exactly. The hybrid, if you will.
Yeah.
All right, can you see the results there?
Well, I can. It looks great.
There you go. 38% of you are already using Office 365 and it's powering the main enterprise intranet. 0 are using SharePoint 2019 on premises, but an equal number of you, 38%, using an older version of SharePoint. 17% of you in limited version, and of course, 8% are not using it at all, but considering it. And I don't think there's much of a surprise there, is there, Rob?
No, not really. I think, 2019's not been out long enough that people have been able to make that jump. I suspect that the older versions of the SharePoint are probably 2013 and 2016. And that's great. 2016 is a great product. 2013 is an okay product, and that just creates opportunities to move to Office 365 or to 2019.
Yeah, and I think more people are still on 2013, but with the launch and the promotion of 2019, they're looking at that migration path to either
Yeah.
16 or 19 now. So for those of you that already have Office 365, this will not look unusual to you because this is the new de facto home out of the box using SharePoint in the cloud. This is what your homepage looks like. Now you can create your own homepage either in custom or sorry, classic or modern, and we'll go to that in a second. But this is essentially what you see. You've got some navigation options on the left, those sites that you are following, and then in the main pane, news from those sites, and then recent activity and those sites that you most frequent. And you can see some of the activity within those sites in terms of who did what, when, and how, and what documents. So you can instantly click on recent activity or your favorite sites, or you can go to one of your bookmarks. So that is the Microsoft's vision of the new home of your intranet, if you will. Now, most people wouldn't want that as a corporate enterprise home for an intranet. So there are 2 different paths that you can take. the modern approach, which is a recent sort of addition in the last year and a half or so, 2 years really, what they call modern pages on SharePoint, which looks like this. It's deployed instantly. It's out of the box. You can choose a theme and a color scheme, and then you update your own content and pictures. Or the classic approach, which is using SharePoint Designer to create your own custom intranet, which looks however you want it to look. This is an example of 3M's award-winning intranet, 2019 Nielsen Norman Group Intranet Design Annual winner, one of the top 10 intranets of the past year from that competition, one of the top 10 best intranets in the world, just part of that little competition. So complicated, complex, custom developed, do whatever you want. Modern, you do what Microsoft wants by following one of a few themes and templates. You can add your own logo. You can choose what color you want across the top. Otherwise, you're following the templates that they've provided. Now, Rob, there are some pros and cons from going to one path versus the other. Modern is fast and it's mobile, but it's not the custom approach that a lot of large organizations and communicators want in terms of their homepage intranet, what everyone in the organization sees when they open up their browser.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, we all got used to what you could do in SharePoint on-prem and classic and all of the customizations that we had. And we had this kind of rich library of web parts that Microsoft provided, plus other things and third parties and so on. And so I think that, if you look at my clients and where we're struggling to get them to modern, and I would say, in the last 6 months, we've actually flipped to almost all of our clients are doing modern, with only a couple of holdouts for some specific reasons. But it's all about, can I get the features I need, and can I get the look good enough to make it feel like it's us? And Microsoft has been rapidly closing those gaps, but there's still a bunch of stuff that we're used to doing in classic world that there aren't good solutions for in the modern space.
Yeah, and so one of the drivers behind this and one of the big complaints about SharePoint is the mobile experience. In classic, it's pretty poor. You're looking at essentially within the browser a
Yes.
desktop view of the intranet
Yep.
in your mobile phone, as you see here on the right.
Yep.
Modern on the left here, it is automatically rendered as mobile friendly and fully responsive, right?
Yeah, and I would say, I put a little asterisk next to the fully responsive. It's very responsive. Um, I think it's still got a couple of quirks, but I think the big difference that you're showing here is that responsive, and what responsive means to, oh, I know I'm on a small device, and so I'm going to collapse certain things. They're going to get deprioritized. I'm going to get them shuffled and moved so that we can focus on small screens to this stuff that is the most important for them. And I think one of the things that you're not actually showing here, which is also super cool in terms of the mobile experience, is the mobile apps.
Yes.
And the complete set of mobile applications that you have, and when you're using modern news, the ability to surface the same news that you're using on your intranet right down into a client app with an experience that's really rich.
And that app works out of the box within the modern experience, but it doesn't with the classic.
Right. Yeah. They decided for news and those items that those are going to be the new news, the new way of doing publications. So if you want that mobile experience, both the responsive web, but also the client app experience, you really need to be pushing towards modern.
Editing's a little bit different in modern versus classic as well. Actually, it's a lot different.
Yes. Yeah.
On
They
the
they've
left here,
give,
you see the modern.
Yep.
It's essentially editing in the page.
Yes. Yeah, it's a banded experience where and that's by the way what gives you the responsive is you get people taught to, hey, I'm going to build this band and this band and this band. It's a totally different set of web parts. They're built with something called the SharePoint framework, and they're not built in the old models. So you can have something in modern that doesn't exist in classic and vice versa. But it's super simple and easy. And in fact, if you literally just paste stuff in from say Word, it more or less works. So super quick and easy.
But you're limited in what you can do
Yeah.
versus classic, which opens up the
Yep.
full traditional editing ribbon
Yep.
when you're editing pages with classic.
Yep. Yeah. It
And
doesn't understand the structure that we used to be able to use.
yeah. And there's search is a little bit different too, at least from the administrative or the communicator's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. The search experience, they're trying to move it in context of the page. So you don't go to a separate page to get your search unless you absolutely have to. So you'll see search uh, most of the time being visible on page. It drops up a drop down box when you start searching versus, in Classic, we would design these great search experiences and we would have custom hover cards and all these great things that honestly, when you're doing an intense search, you need. But that is not the typical preferred mechanism when you start to shift to modern. And Microsoft's got a big initiative for Microsoft Search, which goes beyond just the SharePoint and the Intranet, but integrating search across all of your applications. So you should be able to search from Outlook and you actually can get hits from your intranet, which is super neat.
Let's talk a little bit about access and controls and groups, access rights.
Yep.
With modern, you get Office 365 groups. With classic, you don't. How would you explain Office 365 groups to the layman or the communicator at the business level?
So I typically, when I'm confronted with this question, I typically talk about it end to end. And so what you have inside of the Office 365 environment is you really have got Exchange running and you've got SharePoint running. And what the group does is it unifies Exchange and SharePoint. So underneath an Office 365 group, not only do you get the security benefits, but you also get a mailbox and an Exchange, and you get a SharePoint site. And so you have to think about, where do I want to be able to not just do security, but to create an experience around this thing? And then I can't have that conversation without saying where Microsoft 2 years ago was trying to drive people into Office 365 groups as an experience. They now have this Microsoft Teams application, web app that fits directly on top of groups, so that the experience for most people when they say, oh, well, I don't see Office 365 groups, I'm saying, well, yeah, that's true, because what you have teams that use the groups and connect you to both SharePoint and Exchange.
Just pulling up Teams there while you talk.
Yeah, it's a great neat experience that integrates those pieces. So I try not to talk about Office 365 groups so much from the point of view of security, though that is one of the functions it does. I spend more time with clients talking about, how do you want groups of people to experience each other? How do you want them to interact?
One last thing that we should point out too, the difference between modern and classic is page download times. Um, Often, I'm not going to say always, but often the modern experience, you're going to get faster downloads. It's out of the box. There's not a lot of custom code to impact the download speeds that you may find with custom, because the more you add to a page in a page design, the slower it's going to load. But we're also talking about Rob, an older sort of technology here.
Yeah, I think there's really three components that go into our overall speed. One is just raw network. And particularly if you're using Office 365, you get a lot of content from the CDN, the content distribution network, which is very fast. The second component is the processing time on server, and a lot of that's been optimized. And then the third component is just how long it takes your browser after it has all the information to figure out what to do with it to display it to you. And modern, really on all three fronts, is faster.
There you go. And that's why it's created so much of a buzz. However, in our experience, we see the larger the organization, the more they tend to want to go to the classic approach and have a completely custom design homepage, which best reflects their culture and communications needs.
Yeah, so we're seeing the same thing, and a lot of times there's a couple of things that become essentials for an organization, like we have to do X, and modern just doesn't do X. It doesn't do it yet, or it's not allowed. And so in places where we can cover that gap now, we do. But we actually still have got quite a few clients that are in classic mode as well.
One of the great new improvements that I've really noticed in recent years, and it really took a jump in about 2016 once the sort of formal integration with the fast search engine happened, is search. It's not perfect, but it keeps getting better.
Yep.
And the more you have within the Office environment or Office 365 environment, the more powerful it can be, because all those tools that you potentially have in Office 365, including PowerPoint and Office and potentially Dynamics and other things, can search right across those digital divides, across the digital workplace, and produce results for you. And there's all sorts of filters. Although I have to admit that within the former classic experience, I liked the filters and the UX design on it a little better than what we see today.
Yeah, I mean, I think Microsoft's announced that they're doing this Microsoft Search, as I alluded to a little earlier. And the cool thing is you're going to get the search experience everywhere. And I used Outlook as an example. You can use Word. What would it be like you're in Word and you're searching your intranet, or you're searching your collaboration spaces, or you're searching your mailbox. And so that's definitely the direction they're going in. We're seeing a modern interface that is perhaps the first iteration of the way that might look. But for me, it's an interesting thing to be able to see how are we going to have search in the future. I think one of the other benefits that happened, and it was one of those things that they didn't really explain, and they've not fully, according to what they've been saying publicly, they've not fully integrated yet, but they have the Microsoft Graph that powers Delve, and I know we're going to talk about Delve here in a minute, but that is also being used to help personalize the search results. It's figuring out who you know and who you work with, and saying, well, if you're searching for something, it's likely something that they've been working on. And so relevance is getting much, much better.
Now, it also, and this is looking at the former UX, by the way, but
Yeah.
just to drive home the point, that not only is the UX updated, but you can also, if you're using a combination of Office 365 and SharePoint on premises for whatever security reasons or business reasons that your organization has decided to pursue or support, you can now get results mixed between what is available in the cloud and what is available on your own servers within your own environment.
Yeah, that's that hybrid model we were talking about a little bit earlier, and the ability to search across anything that you care about. So not just the stuff that's in Office 365, but even the things which are on, they're buried in some file share somewhere that, nobody wants to move. You can still get that as a part of search. And that's, I think that's the panacea. That's what we've been looking for, is how do I get to enterprise search? How do I find stuff no matter where it is? And I think we're really, really close to seeing that vision come to life.
I like this UX on the search better, by the way, with the filters down the left-hand side.
I do too.
Yeah.
We replicate this view in modern for customers sometimes,
Oh, that's
just
good.
because the UX is so much better.
Yeah. Now, Delve, for those of you on older versions, particularly 2010 and 2013, My Site was a popular function and application within SharePoint. Now it's sort of separated, but it's enhanced and it's more than just a My Site. It's now called Delve, and it's powered by, as you said, Microsoft Graph, and it provides that next level of social networking or employee networking by connecting you to people and the most popular documents that and places that things that you are using and what they are using. How would you explain Microsoft Graph, the engine behind Delve, Rob?
Yeah, so what the way that social network analysis works, which is what's powering Graph, is it looks for signals. And in our case with Office 365, that signal could be that we attended the same meeting because it's got Exchange Online, it knows that. It could be that we both edited a document or we did, one of 50 different things. And it's not quite 50, but there's a few signals. And what it does is it converts those into edges, and those edges are the things, they're the connections, right? Like, so Toby, you and I are connected based on the shared experiences we have, and the strength of that connection is also recorded. And so then when it goes to say, if I were to go out and say, hey, basically when I go to Delve, I'm saying, hey, what's interesting in my world? What's the stuff around me that I might care about? What it does is it looks at all my connections and what they've been doing, and it sort of takes the strength of the connection and how important that thing is to them, and then it gives me the set of cards that you have here showing, here are the things that might be interesting. In this case, Paul is working on something on Intranet experts, and you should be interested in that.
Exactly. And you still have your profile, what used to be your site. But it's a little bit different, a little bit enhanced. And of course, there is a emphasis on what you've been working on recently. Get back to your recent documents and email attachments, which is a nice little addition.
Yeah,
I
it's
don't default to my profile a lot. It's a different way of working, right? Um, but some people really like it. And you've also got a blog in there as well, where you can, blog to your fellow colleagues and those that are you're connected with.
yeah, I think it's interesting because we were talking about my site, and my site still exists, but interestingly enough, that's your OneDrive. Um, and my site in classic world actually was always these two pieces that they kind of stitched together and made look like one. And so this, the profile functionality was in that space, but it was always dry, right? Like you'd go in and you're like, hey, nothing's changed here in any time, in since the dawn of time. And this is a neat experience where it can go, oh yeah, I was working on that yesterday, and I need to get that to Jim because Jim needs a copy of it or something. It gives you some visibility of the things you've done, which is, as you said, for some people that's really useful. And I, like you, I don't go here. I actually never go here. It's easy to get to. You can type delve.office.com and you'll get there, but it just is not the experience for me. In honesty, when I'm working on files, most of the time I'm using my OneDrive sync folders. I'm not actually navigating to the files I'm working on through the web at all.
And that's particularly for people that are used to Box and Dropbox. That tends to be the more preferred path. Just go to OneDrive
That's what
and
you're used to. Yeah.
navigate. And people who love Windows Explorer also like that. And I always like Windows Explorer. Yammer is pretty much the same as it always was. It's still somewhat isolated off in its own corner of the digital workplace. But now there is an option to integrate it into Microsoft Teams, but it's typically where people go to do microblogging, a la Twitter, tweets, business-related tweets. It's a little more robust in terms of characters and images and that sort of thing. And it's internal, but it is what it is, and it hasn't really changed a lot in recent years, has it?
Not a ton. They've had some functionality, and they got a lot of pushback on files being stored separately in Yammer. So now that you can kind of force Yammer to store the files in SharePoint, and as you said, there's some better integration with Teams and being able to add it there. But by and large, Yammer is Yammer. And if you have a Yammer deployment or you've got a large organization, Yammer is going to keep doing the things that Yammer's always done.
What they have focused their energies on in terms of the social experience is Microsoft Teams, which is a real challenge and answer to Slack for those organizations that are using Slack, but it's, in my opinion, a little more involved and a little more robust than Slack and just your standard messaging platform, including the aforementioned integration with Yammer. So now you can integrate Yammer into Teams and follow channels or follow hashtags quite easily.
Yeah, I think, as you're talking about this difference between Teams and Slack, you have to think about Teams as a bigger thing, because Teams has so much more that it does for you and can do for you in terms of file management, which is SharePoint on the back end, but it gives you that experience, the ability to do chat, phone calls. If you've got an E5 license, you literally can not need your phone, and you can do both video and regular audio calls, even to anybody with any kind of a phone.
Yeah, it's really quite an innovation by Microsoft, and I don't think of Microsoft at the top of my list when I think of innovation, but they've really, I think, invested in a great product here in Teams, which has a lot of options and a lot of functionality, and it seems to be growing by the month in terms of collaboration options with your fellow employees by integrating other parts of Office 365, integrating outside tools. We've integrated Asana project management, the wiki, and now you can even leave and look at voicemail and get a transcript of the voicemail all within Teams.
Yeah, it's beautiful things that they're doing, have done and are doing. It was just last month that they announced Teams broadcast. Both Microsoft Stream, which is another part of Office 365, and Teams now have a live broadcast functionality. So if you need to do a town hall across locations for less than 5,000 people, you can do that directly from Teams. You don't have to pay for a third-party service to do that.
Yeah, fantastic addition to the Office 365 and SharePoint universe. And by the way, we don't go into Office 365 video or Microsoft Stream in this webinar today. There's only so much time, but I do touch on it in the article that I published last week at intranetblog.com, intranetblog.com, if you want to check out the SharePoint for Communicators article and touch a little bit on some of the finer details of SharePoint and including Microsoft Stream, the new video and broadcasting service within the Office and Office 365 universe. Now, let's talk a little bit about content management and managing content and creating content. This is what we would see editing a traditional page in Classic, right?
The wiki page, yeah.
Yeah, you go and click on the cog or the wheel in the upper right-hand corner. You edit the page and opens the ribbon, and you can start managing editing in the traditional sense of doing so, right? A little bit more involved, a few more clicks, more options in terms of formatting and controls, right?
Yeah.
But requires an extra level of training and familiarity with the solution versus the new modern approach, which is literally editing in the page, as we see here, but there are fewer controls and options in terms of formatting and manipulating that content, isn't there, Rob?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's less complex. I think that doesn't necessarily mean you're losing a ton of features. Um, and I think that your clients just like ours. The big thing is they build a lot of content in Word and it goes through revisions and approvals and blah blah blah. And then the very last thing they want to do is they want to copy that Word document into a page, and it does that very 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 well. I think the other thing which is interesting about the new modern pages is they've made photos first-class citizens. And so every page has a header, and they encourage you, not so gently, to include a photo up in that header to draw people's attention and interest. Um, and that's a kind of an awareness of we're not in the green screen text world anymore. We're in a world that we expect to see good design and good visuals to help clue us into what we want to see. Um, so it's a beautiful experience is the way that I typically explain it. And then people are like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, well, it's really pretty. Um, and I know for a lot of our clients, that's important.
Yeah, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the modern pages and haven't played with it yet, if you have Office 365, I see no one has 2019, that's okay. Go in and play with it. What you want to do is create a communication site or even a hub site, and you'll see the options come up and the various templates and layouts that you can play with. And it's very image focused, and there's, as Rob said, a heavy emphasis on using images in on your home pages in particular. Behind the scenes, we still have the taxonomy and term store, and not a lot of changes to the term store itself, but some changes, Rob, in how we can filter and add
How we can manage
taxonomical
content with it. Yeah.
controls to lists in particular.
Yeah, I think when this feature was introduced, the ability to have a hierarchy of terms was really important. The ability to reuse terms, the ability to manage data in a way that was richer than we have ever had before. And you're right, we've not seen major updates in this functionality in quite a while. But what they're doing is where when it was first released, it didn't have reach into everything. Like the client apps didn't really support it very well. And I think now this has finally reached a level of maturity where it can start to show up in lots of places like the document libraries and the filters for them, as well as how they show up inside of search as a refiner. It's really, this has finally grown up and come to be a real part of the platform.
Just to rewind and provide a 50,000 foot level view of this, because most of our clients, when we start working with them, are not using a taxonomy term store for classifying their content. But for those of you who have not implemented this, and I would think most of you have not, your taxonomy is your classification set for your intranet. It's your Dewey Decimal System for your intranet. So how you tag your pages when you create a page and you post it to the intranet, what is the metadata or terms or keywords that you are applying to that page? You want your publishers to do so in a systematic, structured format by applying terms and keywords from a taxonomy tree or term store in this case, so that content is properly classified and the search engine has a better and easier time of indexing and returning results based upon the tags and the terms you apply to that content.
Yeah, that and the other thing that we find with customers when they do this right, so we'll come in sometimes, we'll do an information architecture, we'll help them figure out kind of how to organize information. One of the hidden benefits is the need to fix, update, revise content that is kind of recurring content. It is so much easier for the creators even to get back into that content when they tagged it properly in the first place, and there's a good system for organizing that content.
Yeah, well said. Let's talk a little bit about the cons, and then we're going to get deeper into creating content and content controls before we open up to questions in about 15 minutes time. Just very quickly, one of the biggest complaints about Office 365 in particular, and all these tools, whether it's on premises or in the cloud, is, we're all using Outlook, we're all using email, which is the default homepage now for the Office 365. But the other stuff, not quite used quite as much. In fact, it says 58% people of users are using Yammer. Probably think that that's probably not, that's a little bit higher than what is actually the case. And there's some confusion about what to use when and how and where, because there are multiple ways to do the same thing or to collaborate. You can use Teams or Team Sites or Delve, and so what do you use when and how? And this creates a little bit of confusion for the average user out there, Rob, especially when we still have Office 365 video and we have Microsoft Stream, and there seems to be these dueling competing tools within the Office universe.
Yeah, I mean this graph gives me anxiety. Um, and or I should say it gives my customers anxiety. And that's I think one of the things that we miss as we're talking about how do we help on the adoption side is how do we help the end user understand how to make these choices, and how do we help them know which is the best answer for different scenarios that they run into. And I think this really illustrates the fact that there's generally 2 or 3 or 10 ways to do something. And even, some of these things we could even just narrow it to SharePoint and there's 5 different ways to do it. And so the trick is, how do we help our users understand acceptable ways of doing it and ways which they're not going to like themselves? And that's a difficult challenge for folks.
Yeah. Another weakness is web content management. This is a Gartner analysis from almost 4 years ago, but it's kind of still relevant today because Microsoft hasn't invested a lot into web content management within SharePoint and the publishing features. They've focused more on hybrid, cloud, mobile, and the social experience to not necessarily to the detriment to web content management and publishing, but it hasn't been the top priority. And when Gartner looked at it versus other core web content management systems and platforms, 3.5 years ago, SharePoint finished dead last versus some of the other more well-known web content management system platforms.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see where they'll be in another year or two, and what the analysts will say, because that was prior to Modern really being out. And even though Modern is a totally different way of doing things, it really wasn't ready for them to do evaluations back then. So I think once we get enough feature parity with Modern, it'll be interesting to see what the analysts like Gartner say about web content management and SharePoint in the modern world.
Yeah, I get a sense that this may be one of the next priorities they're going to start to turn their attention to, because they have put so much attention into modern and mobile and social. I think that publishing, creating intranet content, and content controls will be Rob, a focus in the future, because for the communicators and those that are on the line today, it's a priority right now.
Yeah, I think, we've been talking about the technology, and that makes sense. We're having a conversation about SharePoint and Office 365. But I think there's this business process, and how do you get the right content out there that is sometimes difficult. And, I know one of the things that some of my customers struggle with is, I want to put the right gates in place so that people can't just publish willy-nilly, but I don't know how to exactly do that, right? And when there's too many hoops, when there's too many things going on, the communicators, the non corporate communicators, the folks in the central communication, don't want to publish content because there's too many things that they've got to get done to be able to get any of their content up. And so what we try to do is talk about what are the things that we can do that we can automate some of that experience. So how do we attach workflows that do the kind of spell checks and sanity checks and term checks and the stuff that we need to do, so that we're giving them some confidence that there is a review process, but that process isn't lengthy, time consuming, requires 14 checkoffs and so forth. And of course, that means you've got to accept that you're going to have some slips. You're absolutely going to end up in some cases where stuff's going to make it out there that you're going to be like, oh wow, the grammar on that was really bad. It ain't good that they put that up there, but that's okay. I mean, you have to you're trading a little bit of velocity and a little bit of volume against this idea that they're going to be perfect control. So one of the other things, Toby, is the blocking of bad paths. Still an amazing number of people, an amazing number of organizations, particularly organizations I work with that are sub 10,000 people, are allowing people to send to the all users distribution list an email. And that's just an absolutely scary thing to me, because you get there's still cake in the break room. And when you're a multi-location organization, there's never cake in your break room. So that's kind of a challenge. The other thing that happens is people start doing their own newsletters, and sometimes those are email and sometimes they're not, rather than doing content through the intranet. So now you're forcing your users to have split attention across all these different places that they might be getting relevant information, and it's difficult but necessary to get them all in the one place. So we're trying to figure out ways with our clients. How do we make it feel safer? So we want to help them get better knowledge. We want them to have an easier ability to retract something if they put something up and it didn't work out so well. How do they do that? And then how do we manage optional reviews? How do we give them the opportunity to say, hey, I'd love for somebody to read this. I'd love for somebody to provide some editing support. I would love really to feel more confident in what I'm producing. And again, we started our conversations around this idea that we wanted to help them with the technology, but a lot of times the problems aren't necessarily technology problems. Most of communicators don't know how to write. And I'm not saying that corporate communicators do, but the people that they're working with, that they're getting stories from, they don't know how to write emotionally. They don't know how to get people's attention. They also don't know how to write in story, so that there is a flow and people feel like they're a part of it. And at the end of it, they don't understand this idea of writing inverted pyramid. So in the inverted pyramid thinking, we want to take the most relevant to everybody stuff, get that out there very quickly, and then start to do details. And sometimes folks write where, oh, well, you can't do this if blah, 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 or whatever. And it tends to make people not want to read the content. So there's this, everybody listens to one radio station. It's WIII-FM. What is in it for me? And I think that we as communicators don't often understand that it being okay for the company's interest versus our own interests, well, that's different, right? Like, so we want to help our communicators communicate knowing that everybody wants to know, what does this mean to me, and how do we make that relevant to them specifically? Every user, every persona, if you're using personas, which I know we both recommend, but how do you make things relevant to those folks all the way down at the end? So, Toby, I think we were talking beforehand a little bit, but the getting the right content on your intranet is probably just as important as getting the right design. And I think that some of that content, we've got to think about, how do we do content that's a little different, right? I know you're a fan of letting the creators get to the front page and getting them a river of news, a place that they can start to talk. And then also, how do you make sure that, oh, this is corporate communication and we have to keep this thing, and whether that's employee benefits re-enrollment, or it's the president has a special announcement, or whatever it is, how do you make room for both of those things in your intranet designs? So Toby, if you were to try and explain to somebody, what is it that news does, would you say that is notifying folks, or like, how would you describe news?
Push content, corporate content.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think news is even a special, and you said push, but it's interesting to people. I think any kind of content can communicate. I think that the more you can communicate, you can get to consistency. I do think that you got to be a little careful about changing things with communications. I know that sometimes organizations say, oh, well, here's the news article and it changes our policy. But I think when you get an experienced communication team, they start to say, change the policy, and then we'll use news to communicate that change. We'll use news to help people understand that thing has changed. So, do you want to quickly talk about some content management do's and don'ts, and let's just do these quick? I know, because we want to get some
couple more minutes, and then we'll open up to questions, and specific questions that you guys may have about content or content management process, or more high-level SharePoint and controls, and what you're doing, and the pitfalls and traps or challenges you have in your organization.
Great. So I'm going to do this real quick. Actually, these next couple of slides. So versioning. I think we've all probably seen the final, right? We've seen the name of V2, V3, given dates, all that kind of stuff. And the problem with doing that is you end up essentially creating the possibility for not sending out the right version. SharePoint has version support built in, both for pages as well as for documents. And used correctly, you can minimize the chance you're going to send the wrong version to somebody, and you don't have to worry about things being overwritten because you've got version control sitting there. But let's do this. Let's talk a little bit about retention, just because I know that it's an issue for folks. I joke that I've seen intranets and in file shares where they still have the Magna Carta on somewhere, There's
Yeah.
stuff since the beginning of time, right?
Yep.
Uh, and the problem with that is if you're trying to do your retention on your intranet and in your file shares, uh, if you try to do that manually, first of all, you're gonna have some really angry lawyers because they're gonna find stuff that they shouldn't find. Um, but also it's just painful for you. I think that if you use the features that are in SharePoint and Office 365 for retention, you get this ability to have a defensible destruction, and perhaps more importantly, it's consistent. So, um, but what do we do about controls? Like, how do we make sure that we're getting the content that we want? I think a lot of folks, when we start to talk about this, don't think about this from the point of view of how can we leverage views to really expose the right things so that we can do the right fixes. And we create our own properties a lot of times for I want this visible or I want this promoted until a certain time, and then we'll say that we want it to go away or to be hidden. We can use this to drive retention. So if we wanted something to only live on the intranet for 10 years, we could have it default for today plus 365 days times 10, or 3,650 days. And then the other thing that we'll do a lot of times is create active views. So these are just the views that are the views of the stuff that we want to be able to see. New in Office 365, there's some cool things for attention views, which highlight the missing information, allows you to resolve those in bulk. So here, I took the Project Gutenberg stuff and loaded it in and applied Dewey Decimal Classification and Library of Congress, and you can see there's somewhere they didn't show up. So I see required information rather than just blank. And that's one of the powers of attention views in SharePoint and Office 365. So that allows us to kind of move through. A lot of folks, I would say, think about required fields. And here I would say there's a caution. The problem with required fields is they break the OneDrive synchronization. So anytime you do that, you're going to make your OneDrive synchronization have a little lock next to it, and that means that it's read-only. So how do you take a look at other strategies for getting the information in? And that could be setting up some workflows in Microsoft Flow or through SharePoint Designer. And the other thing that we use a lot is setting default column values. I call this tricking users into entering metadata. So a folder will, if you put something in a particular folder, it will automatically apply metadata for you. And so that's super, super powerful. So let's do this last one, and then I'll hand it back to you, and we'll hopefully get some questions that we can answer from folks. So I mentioned that retention, and really you can use information management retention for anything, because every item in SharePoint has a retention that can be set, and you can have the retention execute a workflow. So the one limitation to this is they run weekly, so you can't do this like, hey, every night I want you to look at this. But at least once a week, you could say, hey, you know what? It's time to review the social policy. It's time to verify that we have the right information for this event that's coming up. So it's a super powerful functionality that we've had in SharePoint and Office 365 that you can use to make sure that your content is always up to date.
Which can be a big problem, and it can be a big problem for the search engine and the search engine results and experience.
Absolutely.
Last few points before we open up to questions, and you can add questions on the panel on the right-hand side. And I know we're a couple of minutes late because when we got started, less than half of the people that ended up tuning up for this webinar were not, in fact, logged in. A couple of key lessons: strategy and plan. SharePoint deploys quickly and easily, and the technology is robust, but you need to have a plan. Otherwise, you most assuredly will fail. Governance, really important. Who owns it? Who can do what? Do's and don'ts, roles and responsibilities. These have to be committed to paper and then baked into the system, as we saw with some of those content controls. Specifically, a content management plan. Who can create news? What are the rules for doing so? How do you format it? How do you write for it? How do you apply those terms and keywords? Budget. Licensing is just one portion and sometimes just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the total cost of SharePoint and Office 365. You need to develop that plan and that governance model and content management plan so that you can budget accordingly, because licensing is just a fraction of the cost. In some cases, maybe only 5 or 10% of the total cost of using SharePoint. And then last but not least, something we didn't spend a lot of time talking on, but a little bit, change management is really key, especially using some of these new social tools. It requires education, it requires training, and it requires communication regularly. And it's more than just putting news on the homepage. That's not just communications. And communications alone is not limited to just news. A lot of education and training is required. And by the way, the very best guy on the planet for training users in SharePoint just happens to be Rob. So you need to check out thorprojects.com if you need to conduct training for your content management contributors and publishers and communicators within your organization. You really should give Rob a call. We'll give you the details and contact information here. There you can reach Rob at thorprojects.com. There's his email and phone number, and mine as well. If you've got a question, by all means, put it in the panel on the left or the right-hand side. And very quickly, let's ask you what we should be doing for our next webinar and give you a vote as to what you'd like to see and what you'd like to learn about in the next webinar. Would you like to learn more about SharePoint and Office 365 or a particular aspect? Would you like to know more about creating intranet news, structure, and system for creating news within the organization? How about an in-depth case study? Or how about employee engagement with content and tools? Or how about something on the intranet redesign process and gaining the funding for doing the whole intranet redesign? Cast your vote now, and we will plan accordingly for our May webinar in the third week of May. 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you for your votes, and there you have it. Our next webinar will be intimately related to what we just talked about, creating intranet news structure and a system for doing so throughout the organization. We've got some great case studies on that, and some of those actually very apropos that you should choose this topic, because some of this is going to be featured. We have a couple of really great case studies on content management, decentralized content management, and creating that news system and structure throughout a big dispersed global organization at this year's Digital Workplace and Internet Global Forum in New York City in November. Unbelievable speakers, including McDonald's, which I think we just confirmed, as well as Duke Energy and the Cotton On Group, as well as some of these. We thought our last conference at Coca-Cola was pretty spectacular. This is going to be 1.5 to 2 times better in terms of content and presenters. It's really going to be amazing. And the early bird discount is still open at intranetglobalforum.com. All right, let's head to questions and find out what specifically more we can tell you about SharePoint. All right, first question. Is there anything you can do with Modern to make it look more customized? Rob, there's not a lot. There's some templates and different color themes, but the whole point of it is being a little bit limited so that it renders mobile friendly and renders more quickly than the classic experience. Yes?
Yeah, I think there are things that you can do. I don't know that they're what you want to do. I know that Mark Cashman a couple of months back talked about the fact that you can change the headers a little bit and the styling of the header. But I think the kind of experiences that some folks are looking for would be very complete. And so, I know a lot of folks are like, hey, I want to get rid of the sweet bar and I want to make it mine. The sweet bar is the stuff at the very, very top that has what we call the waffle menu on the upper left. That stuff is not so changeable. You can have developers build SharePoint Foundation web parts, so you can get some custom web parts to make the page richer and to match the kind of experience that your users expect. But yeah, by and large, it's not the complete experience that you might be used to on-prem.
Yeah, so to answer your question, Amy, that lovely, wonderful global intranet homepage that you guys have at Coca-Cola, you cannot create that in modern, but you can in classic. Question, Rob, are Yammer and Teams available on SharePoint 2019 on premises or only Office 365?
Both of those services are 365 only services. What they will do long term, I don't know. And you can sort of get that on Teams. It sort of makes sense. And Yammer has historically always been cloud, right? Teams, the way that you can kind of say, oh, it's probably going to be 365 only, is one of its prereqs, as we talked about a little earlier, is Office 365 groups. Well, you kind of have to have Office 365 to have an Office 365 group.
Yeah. Now, I think you can license Yammer on its own, strictly Yammer. Can you? I think you can still.
I don't know if you can or not anymore. I actually, yeah, I haven't had a customer want to do that in a long time, so I don't know.
No, I haven't either. To be honest, I can't even recall. There's so many changes in licensing and features and all the rest of it over the years that I can't recall. But in short, Lisa, Yammer and Teams are only available in the cloud and through Office 365. And whether you can do Yammer strictly by itself, that would be no. Teams strictly by itself, I don't think so. I think it's, they want you to go to Office 365. As far as I know, you can't license Teams strictly by itself, right, Rob?
Correct, because you have to have the underlying services for Exchange and SharePoint.
Yeah. Next question from Nicole. Can you talk about communication sites? Yes. I'm interested in hearing any insight about how, when they should be used and any pros and cons of using them. Thank you. Well, firstly, what you need to know, Nicole, and Rob, jump in here, is that communications sites is the new modern experience. So if you want to go with the modern, you are going with communications and hub sites, right? So all those limitations we talked about in terms of editing and custom design, which we were just talking about with respect to the options at Coca-Cola, those are the limitations you get with communication sites.
Yeah. So I think communication sites and hub sites have some, it's kind of like layers, right? Like you build on modern and then you get a couple of extra things to them. And the hub sites are pretty new. I'd be surprised if many people have them implemented yet. And we didn't really explain them, but hub sites are really the ability to say all of the sites that are associated with this hub site have the same look and feel, they have the same kinds of things. So in a large organization, a hub site might be a division, it might be a line of work, it might be an industry, but it's something that kind of ties them together so that they should feel similar.
Yeah, well said. Janet says and asks, really interesting and learned new things. SP Modern Online is actually quite good for small organizations with little tech support. Exactly. Yep. You hit the nail on the head, Janet. But Any advice, Rob, to dealing with Microsoft adding new features often and helping authors and users cope with all the new announcements and new features that they're rolling out over time? And Rob is the perfect guy to ask for it because he is the training guy with respect to SharePoint and Office 365. How do
Yeah.
administrators and communicators who own these SharePoint deployments, how do they cope with all these new features and new bells and whistles that are continually being rolled out every week?
Yeah. So we do the SharePoint Shepherd's Guide, which is these really how-to 2-minute videos and associated step-by-step instructions. And this is one of the things that is really difficult for us to get right because they all make changes so frequently, the UX changes, and we're constantly doing updates. I think that you have to use a set of strategies, not just one. Strategy number one is you need to have somebody who is keeping an eye on the announcements that Microsoft's putting out. That means the roadmap, that means the administrative notifications, and so forth. So you really kind of have to have somebody on that so that you know, hey, they're going to release this in the next 3 days, because that's sometimes the notice you get. I think the other thing that we recommend for customers is a canary tenant. And you're like, hey, what's this canary tenant? And it's a throwback to the old mines where they keep a canary because the canary was more sensitive. What you do is you create a separate tenant that you license 1 or 2 users in, and you set it on first release. So anything that's coming, you'll see there first. That gives you a place to go look, to sometimes build some training materials, and to be ready for it. And then the last thing is then how do you support your help desk in the inevitable chance that some things are going to slip through? And I say inevitable because it is. There's just no way to cast a big enough, good enough net to catch it all. And then how do you train your help desk to support that? So no great answers, but certainly if you build it and you plan to manage it, you can be effective.
Excellent points. I love the canary tenant idea. It's a fantastic suggestion, and one probably not enough organizations do. You know, it's a great place to play with these new features and functions as well before you roll it out to the greater audience.
Yep.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you all for your questions. We went a little bit late to accommodate everyone in those questions. Just a reminder for future events and webinars, including notification on the May webinar on creating content management structure and system. Make sure you're subscribed to the newsletter. You can go to prescientdigital.com, scroll to the bottom of the page, input your email, and bang, you are subscribed. For further information or for help, either with setting up an intranet strategy or plan, whether it's Microsoft or otherwise, you can give us a shout or drop us a line there. And if you want very specific SharePoint instruction, help, consulting, give Rob a shout. There's his number, there's his email. It was a pleasure doing this with you today, Rob. Thank you for joining us.
Likewise.
We're going to see you at the SharePoint conference in Las Vegas, will we?
Maybe. I am planning on being there, but I can't guarantee it. Got some things going on that may not have me there.
Ditto for me. For those of you who don't know about it, it is next month in Las Vegas. It's always a good conference. It's also a good way to stay on top of all these new features and new additions and functionality being rolled out in SharePoint and Office 365. So there you have it. SharePoint for Communicators. Be sure to check out the article on intranetblog.com, and we will link to the very new white paper that we're releasing on SharePoint for Communicators through that article and through prescientdigital.com if you want a more detailed look at SharePoint from the communicator's perspective and how to use it best, particularly for content and content management. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Toby.
Thank you all for tuning in. We will see you next month on the next Intranet Insight webinar. Until then, best of luck with all of your SharePoint and Intranet endeavors. We will talk to you then. Happy intranetting.